Hello, South Africa, and welcome back to Coronacast, your twice-weekly show, keeping you up to date with the latest happenings in the country around the coronavirus and the country's response to it. Well, we're on day 89 of the extended lockdown and day 23 of the extended level 3. So obviously lots of interest last week in what the president had to say and waiting a lot of the regulations, but really grateful that so much more of our economy has been able to open up, given the impact that the virus has had not on the lives and the livelihoods of ordinary South Africans. And the question we're going to be talking about and focusing on a lot today is, what has the economic impact of the lockdown been? I think it's very easy to separate the lockdown and the corona crisis. And I think that what we've seen the president trying to do in his letter to the nation this week was essentially indicate that the coronavirus is the reason why we're in a difficult financial situation. When in fact, that's not the case at all, that there's some predisposed conditions that were in the economy, and it's government's response to the crisis, this hard lockdown, that has started to bite very, very hard into the economy and onto the prospects and ability of South Africans being able to provide for themselves and their families going forward. But we start on a slightly more somber note, and that was the unfortunate news that's come around the corruption that has set in around the coronavirus relief funds and the like. Now, at the beginning of the process, the president made a commitment to South Africa that the huge amounts of money that government was making available would be made sure that they go directly to the recipients that need them, and that a very hard line would be taken against corruption surrounding the COVID crisis. We've seen so many times in recent history where public funds have been completely abused. Even for big public funerals, we've seen money being channeled into the pockets and hands of the connected few and not actually going where they were needed the most. And so we noticed this week that the UIF, 5.7 million in funds intended for over 200 workers, found its way into the accounts of a single person, who then very quickly disbursed it to friends, connections and family. And now we've had to have the authorities freezing over 28 bank accounts. Obviously, there needs to be some accountability. And this in an environment where we on a daily basis receive hundreds of calls and emails from South Africans wondering where their money is. Where is the 350 Rand that was promised? Where is the UIF? Where is the TERS funding? Where is the sectoral relief? Only 3.5% of the 200 billion Rand loan, guaranteed loan scheme has been deployed since April. This is not good enough. What you want to do in a financial crisis is to get money where it's needed most into the hands of the people who need it, so that you can keep the economy moving. And unfortunately, once again, we've seen this funding, as well as intentioned as it may have been, running headlong into the wall of the incapable state. UIF, Department of Labour, SASSA, just simply wholly unable to be able to do the very jobs that they exist to do, which is to ensure that they're able to assist those in need when they need it most. But this is also an important week for South Africa. This is the week that Chief Ngwenya, our Minister of Finance, will be tabling the supplementary budget. Now, obviously, the situation from February to the one we find ourselves now as we sit here today is completely different, and it's going to require a completely new budgetary response. But the big question on everybody's minds is, where is the money? Where is it going to come from? And how are we going to, what magic is Chief Ngwenya going to do to both fill the huge gap in tax revenues, but also to ensure that we have a growth agenda going forward? Our economy has been in contraction for a very, very long time, and obviously this has its own problems. And so, to discuss these important matters, I've got two very special guests with me today. First is Geordin Hill-Lewis, who's our Shadow Minister of Finance, and who very eloquently and very deftly delivered our alternative budget statement and what we expect to see coming out of the supplementary agenda, and who released a terrific document that the DA has been hard at work on in terms of talking about how we get out of the mess, how we get onto a trajectory of growth, of jobs and prosperity, and off this terrible high debt, low growth, high unemployment trajectory that the policy regime of the last decade and a half have put us onto. And then I'm joined very, very lucky and certainly really appreciative of the time that he's made to be with us on Coronacast Day, is somebody who's a familiar voice to many South Africans on radio and television as well, and that's Dawie Roodt. He's the Chief Economist at the Efficient Group, and he's going to be talking us through some of the economic implications of what COVID and some of the choices government has made over the course of the last little while. We were supposed to be joined by Gwen Ngwenya, but unfortunately Gwen has got some technical problems. We're going to see if we can try and get her onto the show later, but if not, we'll get her back next week. And Gwen Ngwenya has been working on the DA's policy response to the financial crisis, so that we were able to put a prospectus of hope and change before citizens to show them that there is a different way forward for South Africa, but only if we're prepared to make the hard choices that are going to get us out of this mess and onto a new paradigm. So Geordin, welcome to Coronacast. Certainly not your first time,
yes.
But welcome back. Great to have you on the show. You delivered our budget statement this week. But what is your view on this corruption that I've mentioned that seems to be permeating into the response?
John, when we have tens of billions of new spending going into the system without the normal procurement and tender procedures, because this is all being done in a time of emergency and so under the framework of emergency spending, then you're going to have fertile ground for massive corruption. And we actually saw this coming some time ago. And when these huge amounts were announced that were going to be spent, probably a month ago now, we made a proposal for a special Inspector General appointed by the Auditor General to actually check every single piece of COVID expenditure that happens as it happens, live, in real time, to intervene to stop this kind of corruption. Mm-hmm. Of course, the Auditor General only spots corruption long after the time, usually more than a year later when he audits the books of various government departments. But that's going to be too late for us now. And that's why we proposed this new position of a Special Inspector General. Unsurprisingly, that proposal hasn't been met favorably by the government, but we're going to keep plugging away at making that proposal because we think it's very important. COVID's going to be with us a long time. There's going to be a huge amount of additional spending on hospitals and staff and so on, and we've got to intervene to stop that corruption from happening before it happens.
Yeah. Let's just talk a little about the slow release. I mean, this has been a consistent theme, both through the UIF, through the TERS, through SASSA, through the sector relief funds. What is the holdup? Why is it so difficult to get money where it's needed most into the hands of the people who deserve to be getting this money at this particular time?
There's a lot of research now globally about governments using the systems that already work to respond to COVID. Trying to build new systems to distribute money in a crisis is very difficult, even in the strongest of countries. In South Africa, we've got a very weak civil service, a very incapable state that struggles to deliver on the basics. To build a new system to distribute huge amounts of cash overnight is nearly impossible. And that's what we're seeing happening. The cash is simply not getting to the people that need it the most as quickly as it should. And so the one that worries me most, actually, John, is the loan scheme to businesses. That is probably the most important intervention that government has come up with to help businesses get through this crisis, apart from the support directly to families through the social grants and so on. But for businesses, the loan scheme is essential, and it's just not working. The distribution mechanism, there's a design problem, and we need to figure out quickly what that is and fix it.
Yeah. Dawie, I'm going to bring you in here, and thanks again to you and the Efficient Group. And thank you for making time to be with us on Coronacast Day. Do you want to talk a little bit about the South African economy, a picture about where we were at and where we find ourselves now, and what you see as any potential for growth, if any, on the horizon?
Yeah, maybe a bit of a background. Thank you very much, John. It's very nice joining you guys here. Maybe a bit of a background on where we were before this crisis. Let me start internationally, if I may. The world, and it's important for us to understand what's going on internationally because South Africa is a small open economy. That means whatever happens internationally affects the South African economy as well. So it's important for us to understand what is going on internationally. Now, internationally, in terms of politics, there was a move to, let's call it a new nationalism. There are many examples of this internationally, like, for example, Brexit, like, for example, Trump. Those are all examples of what I call new nationalism. And that is important for the economy because that led to all sorts of other things. And I think the trade war is a very important example of that. The trade war between America and the Chinese, as an example, which will affect small open economies like South Africa. And quite ironically, the reality now today is now that countries are isolating themselves because of the virus, we in a way see what would happen if this form of the trade war reaches its absurd levels that some politicians are suggesting. So in a way, we see the results of a trade war, but not because of a trade war, because of a virus. So that's what we saw internationally, a new form of nationalism. Secondly, internationally also debt levels, especially of governments, but also of certain kinds of companies in the United States particularly, have reached levels that the last time we saw this was just after the Second World War. So debt levels are exceptionally high internationally. And the third important point that I think is also worth mentioning is that monetary policy is exceptionally accommodative internationally. So central banks have lowered interest rates to zero, in some instances below zero, and central banks are printing money, making money out of nothing, and buying all sort of financial instruments with that, forcing what we call the yield curve down, and in some instances below zero. Let me give you an example. If you want to lend money to the German government, you have to pay them before they take your money. So that is what happened internationally. As far as South Africa is concerned, I'm afraid, especially in the past 5 years, but longer, in fact, longer than the past 10 years, the South African economy hasn't been doing very well. The past 5 years, the average South African has been getting poorer on a per capita basis. Now, there are many definitions for a recession. The normal definition is 2 negative economic growth quarters. And South Africa, in fact, experienced 2 negative economic growth quarters last year. So we are officially in a so-called technical recession. But what's more important to me is if the economy is growing below potential, if people are getting poorer. And that's exactly what's been happening in South Africa for the past 5 years. In fact, this year will be the 6th year where the average South African will be getting poorer. So we have been getting poorer the past 5 years. Now, many reasons for that, but I would primarily blame the ANC or the tripartite alliance government for the South African economy or the lack of growth in the South African economy. Now, let me give you one example. Remember, the president is actually the chief civil servant. So as an economist, I look at the biggest player in the South African economy, and that is the fiscus or the state. And the state today is more than 30%, more than a third of the South African economy is taken up by what we call the state. If you include other pieces of the state, like the local authorities and the state-owned enterprises, that's much, much bigger. But the national government, the central government is more than 30% of the South African economy. Now, there are many numbers that economists look at. 1 or 2 numbers that I think are very important are things like, for example, the debt levels. And don't think it's government debt, by the way. It is state debt, and state debt means it's your debt and it's my debt. You and I will have to repay that debt. Now, 10 years ago, state debt levels were less than 25% of GDP, less than 25% of the size of the South African economy. And in a matter of 10 years, that number doubled, and today, the state debt as a percentage of GDP is well above 60% of GDP. That happened at the time when Pravin Gordhan was mostly the Minister of Finance. And 2 things basically happened in the past 10 years. They started increasing spending on the civil servants, especially on a wage bill, like there's no more tomorrow. And they've increased the spending on the state-owned enterprises as well. But what's happening, the third spending item that will become much more important from now onwards is interest on state debt. We have to pay interest on this. If you pay more on interest on state debt, either you have to get more taxes in, or you have to spend less on something else. So that's going to be a very important topic over the next couple of years, where we're going to get that interest from. So the last 10 years especially, but especially the past 5 years, things haven't been going well in the South African economy. In fact, we were in crisis before the virus. Let me repeat that. We were in very, very deep financial crisis before this virus. And in fact, I did some analysis. I don't think the South African economy can grow faster than 1%, simply because we do not have electricity. And I haven't even included Eskom in these numbers. If you include Eskom in these numbers and South African Airways and the other state-owned enterprises, then the numbers look horribly much worse than what I've just mentioned. Maybe just 1 or 2 comments about 2020. I expect the economy to contract by around about 10% this year. The fiscal deficit is likely to be around about 15% to GDP, and the state debt levels now is likely to exceed 80% to GDP by the end of the current financial year. And if you add to that the total outstanding debt of Eskom, nearly 500 billion rand, we're talking about state debt levels exceeding 90% of GDP. Now, economists quite often refer to this as a so-called fiscal debt trap, and that's where we are. We are currently in a fiscal debt trap, and I'm afraid it's going to be extremely difficult and very, very painful to get out of this.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Dawie. Geordin, I mean, you've heard from Dawie there. He's painted a very stark but very good picture about where we sit at. Yesterday, you delivered the supplementary alternative supplementary budget. Do you want to just talk about some of the risks that you see? Do you share Dawie's view on this, and what can be done what steps can be taken to ameliorate against this?
No, thanks for that great summary, Dawie. The point that we made yesterday, John, is that South Africa came into this crisis lacking resilience. And as a result of the lockdown, any resilience that was left, resilience to economic crisis, has been obliterated. So what we need on Wednesday is what I called a resilience budget. A budget that helps families and businesses to brace for the coming impact of a profound economic crisis, and hopefully to be able to get through it as best as can. Now, why do I say that businesses and families were so vulnerable? As Dawie says, we came into this crisis with exceedingly high debt levels. What you would ordinarily like to see in a time of crisis is for government to have low debt and high savings, so that when crisis hits, you save for a rainy day, and when the rainy day arrives, you are able to really respond with serious firepower.
Can I interrupt you? Were there countries that were able to do this?
There were absolutely countries that were able to give serious financial firepower, not from the Reserve Bank, which is what some people are calling for in South Africa today, but from the state itself to answer the call in time of crisis. South Africa, completely unable to do that. Very high debt levels, and now the crisis hits. So that's why I say there was this profound vulnerability. And we then go into a lockdown, the world's longest and hardest economic lockdown, and whatever resilience was left was just obliterated. Families lost all of their savings, many people lost their jobs, and so many people lost their livelihoods unnecessarily. And that's why I really do say that this emergency budget tomorrow is tabled with the government with blood on its hands. That's absolutely true. What we have to do now, we have to be realistic and pragmatic. There's no way that we can get debt under control in this year. We have a crisis to respond to. But the most important thing, and picking up on what Dawie has said, is to show that you can get it under control at some point in the very near future. And government is not yet able to show that. There was this hilarious thing that happened over the weekend, John, at about 17 minutes past 2 in the morning, on Saturday morning. The Minister of Finance tweeted a leaked slide from his own budget. Who knows what he was doing at 17 minutes past 2, but there it is. And I think he may actually have done so deliberately to leak the worst news from the budget up
Flying
front.
a cut.
Exactly. And what that slide showed was quite terrifying. It showed that beyond what Dawie said about debt jumping to 80% in this year, that it continues to grow to 115% of GDP over the next 5 or 6 years, and importantly, is still going up. No plan to get it under control over the medium term. And that is going to make the interest rate that we pay on that debt much, much higher. Just like every person watching the show, just like you and I, the government pays an interest rate on our so-called national credit card. And when our lenders, people who lend money to us internationally, see that we have no plan to get that debt under control, and that we are essentially waving the white flag on fiscal discipline, financial discipline, then the interest rate on that debt goes up, and we pay ever more to borrow money, and that means less and less money for basic services and to look after the needs of the poor in our country. Now already, just to give you some idea of how serious that situation is, this year we're going to spend 230 billion just on paying the interest on the credit card.
Geordin, let's just stop you for a second. I mean, there's people watching at home. they're saying, well, these are big numbers. How does this affect the man on the street? What does this actually mean for
Very important.
for the man on the street?
Very important. When you pay more tax every year, when your petrol tax goes up, when you're paying more tax per litre of petrol than you are paying for petrol, when your income tax goes up, when VAT has to go up, when prices are more expensive because the rand keeps falling in value, that is because we have a government that is unable to exercise basic financial discipline and must make you, the citizen, pay for it over time. That's the bottom line. That is the bottom line. When fewer and fewer people have jobs over time, and when pensioners only get 10 or 20 rand extra on their pension every year, they should not be grateful to the state for that 10 rand increase, because the only reason they're able to get such a small increase is because the state has got to spend more and more money paying the bill on the credit card.
Yeah. So one of the ways that they're saying we're going to get out of this, Dawie, is an IMF loan. What is your viewpoint on borrowing more money to get out of debt? And is this IMF loan a good idea?
John, maybe everybody we are really painting a very bleak picture about the future of the South African economy. But I'm gonna try to answer that question, but I'm gonna start with the South African Reserve Bank because the whole thing ties in. There are basically two instruments available to the to government or to the authorities. One is the fiscal policy, what we've just been talking about. The fiscal policy simply does not have the room anymore to support the South African economy. We should have, when times were much better than now, we should have put some money back in the bank. We should have kept some dry ammunition so that we could be in a position where the state can spend a huge amount of money to support the economy. They simply cannot do that because of previous mismanagement. So fiscal policy is basically not available. There's another policy instrument, and that is monetary policy. And that is what the Reserve Bank is doing. And I can tell you, Lesetja Kandagu has been doing an absolutely brilliant job the last 5 years, and for the next 5 years, I believe, as well. Because he has been running a fairly tight monetary policy ship. That means that he's been keeping interest rates relatively high, and he's been quite an aggressive guy when it comes to bank supervision, for example. So he really made sure that the bank stayed on the straight and narrow. And many economists criticized the Reserve Bank. Many economists said, and so even politicians said, that the Reserve Bank is too conservative. They should have cut interest rates a long time ago. I did not criticize the Reserve Bank because the Reserve Bank, what they were doing, they were keeping some dry ammunition exactly for a kind of situation in which we find ourselves now in. And the Reserve Bank did a number of things. They cut interest rates, they relaxed some of the liquidity and capital requirements on the banks, and they also started to participate in a secondary market on the capital market. We can talk about that as well. But not only that, the Reserve Bank defended its own independence. And they also managed the South African reserves. And currently, there are more than $50 billion worth of reserves at the South African Reserve Bank. Now, coming back to your question on whether we need an IMF loan or not. If you want an IMF loan, you are basically borrowing dollars. And before you ask the question, do I need an IMF loan? You must answer the question, what do I want to do with dollars? Now, there's plenty of dollars at the South African Reserve Bank, money that cannot be used for anything else but to repay foreign loans, government, dollar-denominated loans primarily. And we may need to import some medical stuff, for example. We need a couple of billion rands for that. But we basically do not need an IMF loan, not yet, because we're going to borrow dollars, and we don't need dollars in South Africa. We need rands. So the big problem is not a lack of dollars. We have that. We have sufficient amounts of dollars because of the way that the Reserve Bank has been managing our reserves, and we don't need a dollar loan or an IMF loan. Maybe a little bit here and there, but talking about the really big money, a couple of 100 billion rand, for example, in an IMF loan, we simply do not need it. There's one benefit of taking an IMF loan under these sort of circumstances. If you borrow from the IMF, that is a stick to make sure that your colleagues stay on the straight and narrow. And I'm referring to the other political leaders in the ANC primarily. But we do not need an IMF loan. And I just cannot understand why everybody keeps on hammering on that specific.
Yeah. Geordin, do you want to talk a little bit about the Reserve Bank and the independence and importance of the independence of the Reserve Bank? And I think that I would agree with Dawie. I think that the governor has been very brave. I think he penned a very good letter this week where he set out very clearly that there's no magic money tree, and it's about being fiscally responsible.
I think every South African can sleep slightly better at night knowing that Lesetja Kganyago is running the Reserve Bank and that institution is still a center of excellence in our country and has by and large resisted fiercely all of the attempts, the onslaught on its independence. And long may that continue. The point about the Reserve Bank is that it is a constitutionally independent institution. It has to cooperate with the government and work together very closely, but it sets its own, it makes its own policy decisions. And that is absolutely critical. And, we should all put shoulder to the wheel in helping defend its independence because it's been under absolute assault by the ANC. We know that the ANC has long wanted to get its hands on the printing presses at Reserve Bank head office. And also the EFF, has openly campaigned on what they call the nationalization of the Reserve Bank, even though, of course, the Reserve Bank is a wholly owned subsidiary of the South African government. It's a nonsensical argument. But what they really mean is to get their hands on and undermine the independence of that bank. And we must all play our part in defending that independence doggedly.
You spoke, Dawie, you started touching on this, the Reserve Bank dabbling in the secondary market. Do you want to just take us through what that means and what your views on it are?
Just for the interest of transparency, I just want to say that I hold 200 shares in the South African Reserve Bank and I get the massive dividend of 16 Rand per year on my shareholding in the South African Reserve Bank.
Okay.
Yes, well, the central bank, like I've mentioned, the South African central bank can do a number of things to support the economy. They've done that because of the way that the central bank was managed in the past. The governor also announced now that they will participate in the secondary market on the capital market. Maybe I can just explain what it means. The process in simple terms works as follows. The government borrows a lot of money. They borrow every day, well, not every day, every week they borrow a lot of money. And they borrow this money primarily in the capital market. And the Reserve Bank does that for them on behalf of government. So the Reserve Bank will sell government debt instruments to what we call the primary dealers. And the primary dealers are a selected few banks. And they will buy this government debt instruments and they will sell it on to their customers, which are typically, say, pension funds or insurers or banks or whatever the case might be. So the Reserve Bank, there's a bit of a debate about that. But the Reserve Bank does not participate in the primary market. In other words, the Reserve Bank does not directly print money to give the government to spend. But what they do quite often is that they will buy government debt instruments from the secondary holders, like, for example, pension funds as an example. And that's what the Reserve Bank did the last couple of months. What happened because of the crisis, the bond yields started going up. When bond yields go up, the prices go down. So bond yields went up. And there was a shortage of liquidity. And the Reserve Bank decided, and I think I agree with that decision, they decided to start buying some of these bonds to provide more liquidity in the market. But the idea was not, and this is the emphasis of the Reserve Bank, the idea is not to fund the government, at least not directly. Indirectly, of course, money ends up with government, but not to directly fund the government. But that's a bit of a slippery slope. And I think they have to be very careful. The past 2 months, they've been funding more than 10 billion per month. And I'm really curious to see what's going to happen with the budget. It's going to be bad news in the budget. If the bond yields are, the question is, will the Reserve Bank fund even more? And that's a number I'm certainly going to keep an eye on, how much the Reserve Bank funds in the secondary market. For now, it's fine. But the Reserve Bank, and I'm sure Lesetja Kganyago knows this very, very well, is that you have to be extremely careful as a central bank not to overdo that, and not to make government dependent on the printing presses, because that is essentially what politicians are after. They want to get control of the printing press, and Lesetja Kganyago is in charge of the printing press. So there is a bit of a grey area between monetary policy and fiscal policy. So far, I'm not concerned, but we have to keep an eye on that.
So here's a fly in the ointment. We've got Insiki Nkani's written in, and thank you for watching, Insika. What is the story about SAA and the new 30 billion bailout proposal? How's that going to impact on Ngweni's room to move on Thursday?
I really hope that Minister Ngweni does not accede to that request or that pressure to provide another huge bailout to SAA. We know he's under huge pressure to do so from his colleagues in government, from unions and from SAA itself. But he has staked his claim, he has set out his line in the sand and said we will not bail out SAA any further, and he has to stick by that. frankly, it wouldn't only be bad economics, it would be immoral, I think, John, to fund SAA in the middle of a unprecedented crisis when families are losing jobs and breadwinners, businesses are going under, and we are proposing to give an extra 33 billion rand to a totally failed state company that cannot fly no matter what happens. So there's no way that bailout can be allowed to happen. And I would go so far as to say that if Minister Ngwenya is forced into providing that bailout, then he'll have to really reconsider his position in this government.
So, Dawie, a lot of focus is going to be on tax and tax instruments and tax responsiveness, etc. And I'm sure that Ngwenya is not going to be able to kick the can down the road and giving some indication around taxes. Now, you've got a very interesting perspective on watching the performance or underperformance of taxes. Do you want to just take us through why this is important and what you'll be looking for?
Just to repeat what I've said. Remember, we are running a fiscal deficit of probably around about 15% of GDP. That's totally and completely, utterly, totally unsustainable. We are
Dawie,
in very deep.
Sorry to interrupt you. I think it's important for viewers at home to know what a fiscal deficit is. It means it's the difference between what government gets in via taxes and what they spend. And we are now currently proposing to spend 15% more than we get in. Just to give you an idea, in the last 30 years, the worst deficit we've ever had was in 1992, which was 7.2%. So our deficit is going to be more than 100% bigger than that. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Back to you, Dawie.
No problem. No problem. In fact, it's the largest fiscal deficit since, I think, 1914. Since after the First World War. So the fiscal deficit is indeed how much they spend more than what they get in, and this is expressed as a percentage of GDP. So it's not 15% more, this is 15% of GDP. We're talking about a number close to 800 billion rand, 800,000 million rand. To put it into, try to picture the following. Imagine there are 800 big schools, and you fill them all up with millionaires. That is how much 800 billion rand is. So it's a huge amount of money. So we have to get that smaller. We just spend too much money. And not only do we spend this money not on the right sort of things, if you borrow a lot of money and you spend it on capital, like, for example, new roads and new infrastructure, then you can use that capital to generate more economic growth. But we're not doing that. We're spending that on current expenditure. We borrow money, long-term money, to pay salaries, for example. So, but nevertheless, so we need to get the fiscal deficit smaller, and that means we either have to increase taxes. By the way, I don't believe the minister is going to increase the taxes tomorrow. He is eventually going to increase taxes quite a lot, but probably not tomorrow. He might hint at some tax increases. So either he's got to increase taxes eventually, or we have to spend less. Now, the interesting thing as an economist, for me at least, as the economy slows down, I analyze the various taxes. Now, there are three major taxes. The first one is personal income taxes, and I believe that is going to collect significantly less than originally budgeted estimates. And the reason, obviously, is people are losing their jobs, people are taking a pay cut, people are not getting employed anymore, and obviously, because of that, the minister will also collect less by way of personal income taxes. But personal income tax is the biggest tax to the Minister of Finance, is probably going to report less of an under collection than some of the other taxes. The second very important tax is value-added taxes. Value-added taxes, obviously, is people spend money, the state collects more taxes, but people were in lockdown, people lost their jobs, they're spending less, and the value-added collections will be significantly below the original estimates of the minister. And the third most important tax is company taxes. And company taxes in South Africa are paid by a small number of companies. But basically, it's probably 80% of company taxes are paid by less than 100 companies in South Africa. So company taxes in South Africa will come under tremendous pressure because company taxes is a much better indicator of underlying economic activity. So because of the economy going to a contraction, into a deep recession or a depression, in fact, but also because many of our companies are international companies. And they're doing business internationally, and the international economy is under pressure as well. And some other taxes, like fuel levy is a very important tax, that will come under pressure. And the silly idea to prevent people from smoking and drinking, as an example, will also result in some of the sin taxes significantly underperform. In total, the total underconnection in taxes is likely to exceed 300 billion rand in the current financial year. And that's the most important reason, in fact, why the fiscal deficit is likely to be more than double relative to the size of the economy than originally budgeted.
Yeah.
Okay, so Geordin, we've heard all this. What do we do to get out of it? I mean, you've released a statement again about a resilience budget and counter-cyclical measures.
Yeah.
What does that mean, and how does that translate into a message for the viewers at home watching this?
I think there's two most important things that the government has to focus on right now. The first is you have to show that you have a plan to get debt under control. As I said, you don't necessarily have to get it under control in this year, because that's very unlikely given the crisis we are in. Debt will increase very significantly this year. But you have to show that you at least have a medium-term plan to get it under control. If you can't do that, people are going to be less and less likely to lend us money, I'm afraid. And if they do, they're going to do it at a much higher price. That's the first thing. The second thing is you've got to reduce the risk that people associate with our country. And the way that you do that is by showing that you really are committed to reforming the economy to make it grow. And when you grow the economy, of course, you get a virtuous cycle. You get more people working and paying income tax and spending money and paying VAT. You get less people relying on a social safety net. And that creates a cycle that doubles in on itself all the time. And when your economy is growing, our lenders around the world see that your economy is growing. They see that it's more likely that you're going to pay your debt, and so they lend to you at a lower and lower price. This is the key thing. So we've got to be fundamentally and singularly obsessed with growth. And that is going to require a genuine commitment to wide-ranging economic reform. Now, the thing is, President Ramaphosa, Minister Ngwenya, and some others, since they were elected, have said that they are committed to a reform agenda. But the progress on delivering that reform agenda has been pitifully slow. So the key question for me tomorrow is going to be, do you have a plan to get debt under control? And do you have a plan to genuinely reform the economy to get it growing so that the risk profile of our country goes down and so that we can get into a virtuous growth cycle over time?
Now, I know one of the things you've been raising over many, many years, and Merle Cohen touches on it, how do we get leadership to cut back on their benefits and wasted money on overseas trips, cars, offices, etc., and to cut that out of the budget? I mean, surely that's something we cannot afford anymore.
No, we definitely can't. There's so many luxuries and kind of budget excess in the government that has to, unfortunately, in the coming years, we have to go back, strip it back to the basics and only do what government's core mandate is to do. And this is what Tito Mboweni means when he talks about this idea of zero-based budgeting, which is a strange term that many may not have heard, but basically what it means is you start with a blank page and you redraw up the budget from the beginning, from zero. And every single rand has to be rejustified. And this is something that we very much support. It's not possible in the short term, can't be done before tomorrow or even probably by the end of this year, but it has to be done to cut out exactly those things that Merle is referring to, those hideous waste and luxuries and excess. There's another important point, and that is the wage bill. Currently, in this year, we are projected to spend 700 billion rand on public sector wages alone. Now, that is also totally unsustainable. Now, in February, before this whole crisis started, the February budget announced a 160 billion cut in public wages. Of course, public sector unions have objected very strongly to that, and there's a lot of internal opposition inside the ANC to that cut. But one of the key things that we're looking for tomorrow is, does he stick to his guns on that cut, or are they going to reverse it? If they reverse that cut, then all of the numbers that we've spoken about so far in this program and all of the things Dawie's mentioned get much worse by 160 billion. So that's going to be a key measurement tomorrow.
Geordin? Can I just add to what you just said? The minister in his budget did say, I'm talking about the February budget, he did say he wants to cut 160 billion rand from the wage bill. In fact, that's not a cut. Even if he was successful in his plans, it still would not have been a cut. It's simply money that he was planning to spend in future that he's going to spend less on. So there will still be an increase in the wage bill, even the so-called cut, but it's not a cut. We have to understand that. Secondly, what we have to understand, and these are my estimate, my calculation, the average civil servant in South Africa is paid approximately 40% better than his private sector equivalent. Now, believe me, there are many civil servants out there that are hopelessly overworked and totally underpaid. But the majority of civil servants in South Africa are simply overpaid. There are something like 30,000 civil servants that are paid more than R1 million a year. 30,000 of them that are made millionaires every year. They're working for the state. And remember, the civil service is not only when you talk about teachers or nurses, the civil service is much more than that. The civil service also includes Eskom, and Eskom is hopelessly overpaid. And there are probably around about 20,000 too many people that are being paid by Eskom. Note, I did say not work at Eskom, being paid by Eskom. And similar sort of numbers can be mentioned on the local authorities. And you also made a comment about a government, and quite often, maybe I can just mention this. As an analyst, and I try to analyze some politics as well. As an analyst, when you talk about a liberation organization or communist party, what we have in South Africa, immediately I think left-leaning policy. So ideologically, the South African government is, let's call it left or socialist. But I think we're making a big mistake as analysts, is that the South African government, or a large chunk of that, is not interested in ideology. They simply live off the state. That's the reason for the existence of the ANC. They simply live off the state. And for that reason, it's going to be so extremely difficult for Tito Mboweni to actually cut back on state spending, because you're going to touch the reason for the existence for the ANC or the tripartite alliance, because they live off the state. So I'm afraid, I guess the starting point, we don't have an economic problem. We've got a political problem in South Africa. And I guess that's up to South Africans to fix that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the areas that Mboweni is under significant pressure on from the ideologues within his organization is this whole issue of prescribed assets. And, you know, he's got Ace Magashule and others breathing down his neck saying it's ANC policy now. We want to see it implemented. What impact does this have on the economy, and is it something that we should be worried about?
We should be extremely worried about that. Let's just unpack this again. We mentioned all this fiscal deficit and the debt levels, all that ugly numbers. The reality is we ran out of money. We ran out of money some time ago already. And there's only one pot of money left. And that pot of money is called the savers pot of money, particularly the pension funds. People, and we're talking about a huge amount of money here. We're probably talking about 30 trillion odd of savings money that's lying there. That's the only pot of money left now. And I'm afraid there's and many of the political leaders have been suggesting that we make use of that. The most recent one was Blyden Zamans is suggesting that we can use that to fund the NSFAS project, for example. But it's ludicrous. You cannot do that. You simply cannot touch that. There's nothing wrong for a pension fund to invest in a state-owned enterprise, provided that you do the investment because it's a good investment. But when you force a pension fund, as an example, to invest, for example, in Eskom, or to so-called convert Eskom debt into equity, essentially what you're doing, you're forcing a pension fund to make a bad investment. And the savers of that pension fund will eventually pay the price. And we've done that in the past. And we've done that to the detriment of the savers in South Africa. But I'm afraid, unless we get some money in the form of extra taxes, we're not going to get that. Or we cut back on state spending, which is unlikely. I'm afraid the only part of money that is left is that of the savers. And it's our responsibility to prevent that as much as possible. It's going to do immense damage, further damage to the South African economy.
Yeah. I mean, particularly in an environment now where we're sitting, Geordin, and you want to talk a little about the labour figures that came out today, but that's the other big looming crisis. We went into this with just over 10 million South Africans unemployed. Treasury's estimates are certainly saying, I think very conservatively, 3 million jobs lost. Do you want us to talk about the impact of that? I mean, these savings are going to be important for people who've lost their jobs and the like.
I want to come to that in a second, but I want to weigh in on prescribed assets, if I may, John, because, you know, Dawie's so right, and it's so refreshing to hear him say that as a from the savings industry himself, because I'm afraid many of his colleagues in the savings industry have been completely quiet on this disastrous proposal that is totally unacceptable. And let's be absolutely clear. If state-owned enterprises and big infrastructure projects were well run in South Africa, there would be no lack of capital and funding for them whatsoever. Pension funds would rush to fund well-run projects and well-run companies. The problem in South Africa is not that pension funds are somehow disloyal or unpatriotic, as has been said about them. It is that these projects are so badly run and these companies are so corruptly run that they are not a good investment. And pension funds have a legal responsibility to look after their clients, the people that they serve, who are ordinary South Africans, men and women who are dutifully putting away a little bit of money every month for their future retirement. And it is absolutely wrong and unacceptable to make those people suffer in retirement to fund the ANC's mismanagement of the economy in those companies. So we absolutely oppose any idea at any proposal for prescribed assets, and will fight it very, very strongly. Now, to come to unemployment. Earlier today, Statistics South Africa released updated employment figures. Very importantly, this is for the first quarter of this year, so only up until the end of March.
So it's almost pre-COVID.
Basically pre-COVID. We'll remember lockdown only started on the 26th or 27th of March, if I remember correctly. And so this does not take into effect the effect of the devastating lockdown. But even without lockdown, unemployment went up by 350,000 people. There are now, on the narrow definition, 7.1 million unemployed South Africans. Those people who have lost hope and who have given up looking for work, if you add them in, it's nearly 10.5 million people, John. That's a devastating number. And I just shudder to think what's going to happen to that number when the second quarter results are released later in the year, because then the full effect of the lockdown will be felt. Treasury says, government's own numbers say, that at best case scenario, 3 million people could lose their jobs because of lockdown. Actually, I think that number is very credible. It's not just a thumbsuck, because if I take you back to the global financial crisis in 2009, our economy contracted by 2.6%. In other words, our economy shrunk by 2.6%. If we go on Dawie's figures, if he's right, 10% contraction. Even if we go on the optimistic figures from the Reserve Bank and Treasury, 7% contraction. That's at least 3 times as bad as the global financial crisis in 2009. And so it's entirely feasible that 3 million more people will lose their jobs. So we could emerge from this with nearly 14 million people on the expanded definition. And that's why we say we've got to brace for impact. We need a budget that helps us brace for impact, because if we think that lockdown was the impact, we're wrong. Lockdown has caused an economic crisis that is about to break over our bow. And that is why we have to brace for impact.
Dawie, do you want to weigh in on the unemployment? What are your predictions on unemployment, and where do you think it's heading?
Yeah, let me, you touched on that, but I think I just want to elaborate a little bit on that we have to understand that the virus is not causing the damage. Of course, the virus is damage, it's dangerous, and of course people are dying, and it's really sad people dying because of the virus, but it's not the virus causing the economic damage, it's the measures that have been put in place to contain the virus. And South Africa's got a particularly strong lockdown compared to other countries, and that's causing immense damage to the South African economy. My estimates for unemployment is not going to be at that high. In fact, I've got my estimate just over 2 million or so. But yes, it doesn't really matter. I mean, this is absolutely horrible, talking about millions of people losing their jobs in South Africa. But maybe a very important point that needs to be made as well. And I would like to make 2 points. The first one is that the biggest killer out there is not the COVID virus. It's not cancer. It's not diabetes or TB. The biggest killer out there is poverty. In fact, we will see a huge increase in poverty because of this lockdown and because of previous mismanagement of the South African economy. According to my estimates, and this is based on what happened in Greece during their crisis, the increase in poverty now will kill over the next 10 years something that close to 300,000 people in South Africa. Far more people will be killed because of poverty than people that will die because of this virus. And we're also talking, I just want to make another point on something a little bit different. The fiscus in South Africa. The fiscus in South Africa is the most redistributive fiscus in the world, which means the guys paying most of the taxes are not the guys getting the benefits of those taxes, which is nothing wrong with. I am in favor of redistribution, but the reality is we cannot tax the rich people in South Africa more, because the rich people in South Africa, there are too few of them, and the ones that are left are completely overtaxed in South Africa. But the main point is, poverty, without a doubt, is by far the biggest killer in the world, and we're going to see a huge increase in poverty in South Africa during 2020 and the years thereafter.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, Dawie, and it's a point we made right after when the president agreed to extend the lockdown, that there was going to come an economic cost, and that we've got to protect lives and livelihoods in South Africa, and focusing on the one to the exclusion of the other was a terrible, terrible mistake. And much like COVID broke like a wave, it's the government's response to the lockdown that's retreating now and then scouring out and causing even more damage on the economy. We've got a question in here from one of the viewers, Bonga, who says that, you guys are arguing for the shutting down of state-owned entities, but what about the job losses at those state-owned entities? Won't that create a crisis? How would we respond? I'll start with you, Geordin, and I'll come to you, Dawie.
Yeah, I will say that, look, there's a trade-off to be made. Every single South African pays much higher electricity prices every month to keep Eskom going, to subsidize the enormous mismanagement, corruption, and loss-making that Eskom is guilty of every year. So you have to ask yourself, how many other people in their economy are unemployed because we are keeping Eskom going? And I would argue that far more people are unemployed in the broader economy because Eskom is such a failure than what are employed in Eskom. So on a straight numerical, like for like, I actually think that unemployment will get better if we solve the Eskom problem by ending their monopoly. But obviously, a lot of people in Eskom will lose their jobs. One never celebrates people losing their jobs, but the tough fact of the matter is that every one of those jobs has been subsidized by the South African taxpayer for most of the last 2 decades, and the same goes for SAA, I'm afraid. So is that just? Is that ethically defensible? I don't really think it is. Every single person who is employed in South Africa, and even those who are unemployed but still spend their social grant money and pay VAT and so on, is subsidizing those jobs. So is it right, this is the way that I always put the question to the ANC, is it right for the bus driver from Mitchell's Plain in Cape Town, or the person who works in the grocery store in Pretoria, to be paying for the people who are employed at SAA and Eskom at hugely inflated salaries? It isn't right. And that's got to stop.
Great. Dawie, do you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, of course I want to. And I want to make I think it's Bonga that asked that question.
Yeah.
Let me answer it and start off with saying something controversial. I think it's a good thing when jobs are lost. Now, let me tell you why I say so. Remember, in a real free economy, what we have, it's a process of creation and a process of destruction. And it's good for companies to go bankrupt, and it's good for people to lose their jobs. Because in a real free economy, new companies are continuously created and new kind of jobs are continuously created as well. And that's right. That is what a free economy should be like. Unfortunately, what we have in South Africa, we're trying to keep companies that should be dead, like South African Airways, we're trying to keep them alive artificially. And in fact, we shouldn't be trying to create jobs. Jobs is not something that can be created. It's easy if you want to create jobs, get 1,000 people to dig 1,000 holes and another 1,000 to fill it up, and you've got 2,000 jobs. But we all agree that's not sustainable. And the only sustainable way of creating jobs is to grow the economy. And the only people that can grow this economy successfully is the private sector. The government has proved themselves over and over again that they cannot run anything. They've destroyed the state-owned enterprises financially and operationally. You can look at just about any state department and compare it to any country in the world. It is mostly a disaster. And now they want to get even more involved. It is simply not going to work. The only way that we can get more people to get employment and to get rid of poverty in South Africa is to allow and give the freedom to the free market to do what they can do best, and that is to create wealth. Wealth is good and poverty is bad. Poverty means the people without jobs and people losing their lives wealth is good because everybody can have a good living standard and all those wonderful things that goes with wealth. And it's only the private sector that can create wealth. Governments all over the world always destroy wealth.
Well, last question for the both of you. I'll start with you, Geordin. What yardsticks are you going to be measuring tomorrow's budget speech by? What would you be looking for to say, well, that was a successful speech?
Does the minister hold the line on state-owned entities and bailouts for SAA in particular? He's got to hold the line on that. Does he hold the line on public sector wage cuts? Is there a credible plan to get debt and spending under control over the medium term? Not immediately, not in this year, but we cannot accept a situation where debt just continues to balloon out of control for the next decade, and there's no money left for the basic services that we need to spend on protecting the poor, in particular in South Africa. And finally, is there a credible, believable commitment to economic reform across the economy? No more just promises. Those promises have become hollow cliches. We need to see action on real reform to get this economy growing, because ultimately Dawie is correct. The only thing that turns this around over time, there is only one thing, and that is economic growth. Without growth, this economy withers and dies, and all of the many people, the millions of people that it supports, become much, much poorer. So the key thing is reform.
Your three takeaways tomorrow that you'll be looking for, Dawie?
I'm not necessarily going to look at numbers. Of course, the numbers are important. But there are three things that I'm going to look out for, and I'm probably going to find it between the lines. The first one is we have a leadership conflict in South Africa. I want to know who's in charge. Is it the president? Is it Ace Magashule? Is it the deputy president? Is it Tito Mboweni? I don't know. And that's important because I don't understand policy. Are they going to nationalize the Reserve Bank or are they not? Because they keep on saying all these different things. So that's the first thing. I want to get an idea who's in charge in South Africa. Secondly, it's inevitable there must be a conflict eventually between whoever is in charge of the ANC and organized labor, especially COSATU. I want to see Tito Mboweni standing strong when it comes to the wage bill, and that means a conflict with particularly their alliance partner, and that is COSATU. And the third thing that we have to, that is the Rubicon that we have to cross. There must be an ideological change in the ANC. I'm afraid I don't think that's going to happen, but they have to realize that we cannot keep on with cadre deployment. We cannot keep on mismanaging the South African economy that we have the way that we have the last couple of years. We have to do something different. Will we get that message from Tito Mboweni? We'll have to wait until tomorrow. But I'm afraid on all three questions, I'm probably going to be disappointed.
No. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I'm going to leave it there. And it's been a great pleasure to have both of you on the show. And I could talk all day about this stuff. And we'll have to maybe have a return match and get you both back to do a bit of post-match analysis of the speech tomorrow. But thank you both for making the time. It's been great to have you both on. And I'm sure we'll all be watching with bated breath tomorrow. Well, there you have it, folks. From a chief economist and our shadow minister, all giving you some tips to what to look out for tomorrow. But all clearly consensus on one thing: we're in deep trouble and we've got to do something to get out, and the business as usual approach is not going to work. We need to see bold reform. We need to see very, very strong standing up for the independence of the Reserve Bank, a hard move against the job-killing horsemen of the apocalypse in South Africa, of poor legislation, policy confusion, cadre deployment and corruption, and a complete incapable state. Those are the things that kill the economy and push South Africans into poverty. And as Dawie so eloquently said, it's poverty that kills more people around the world rather than individual diseases. We end the show at a somber note, and it is with great sadness that I learned last Friday that one of my colleagues in the National Assembly, the Honourable Thandi Mpambo Sibakwana, had lost her life. She'd been ill and had unfortunately passed away, and our condolences go to her friends and family. Thandi's passing has left a huge void in our parliamentary caucus, and she will always be remembered for her incredible work ethic, her smile that would be able to solve even the greatest of problems, but just the generosity of spirit that Thandi was able to show to her colleagues whenever they were going through a tough time. She would be the person to whom so many of us turned for consolation and advice. Sis Thandi, rest in peace. We will never forget you and the contribution that you've made to South Africa. We'll see you on Friday this week for another exciting version of Coronacast. I will be giving you some advice and some news on what we're doing on UIF and TERS. We're going to be launching an exciting new platform to be able to escalate UIF and TERS issues. We are inundated, as I said, with calls from all of you around people who are not being paid, not hearing back. And I give you the assurance we will plot a way forward for you, as well as an update on where we're sitting with a variety of our court challenges. We'll see you on Friday, same time, same place. Until then, stay safe, South Africa.